Welcome to the inre rummet, the inner room. I'm Ayşegül Aksoy, family therapist, sexual educator, and founder of Mindful Homes. This is a podcast about therapy, sex, relationships, mental health, and everything in between. Trauma is not always about what we remember. Sometimes it shows up as shame, panic, numbness, self-hatred, or a constant swing between overwhelm and disconnection. Its imprint can remain in both the mind and the body long after the original danger has passed. So how do we make sense of these reactions? What are they trying to tell us? And what changes when we stop seeing them as signs that something is wrong and start seeing them as signs of survival? In today's episode, I am joined by Dr. Janina Fisher, a clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, clinical trainer, and author of several books about trauma. She has worked in the field of trauma for more than 30 years and is internationally recognized for shaping a more compassionate understanding of trauma, suffering, survival, and healing. Welcome, Dr. Fisher.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm very excited to have you on my podcast and grateful for the opportunity to learn from your knowledge and experience in the field of trauma.
And I'm always happy to talk about it.
And it's really amazing to be able to meet like this across countries, you in the States and I in Sweden.
Yes.
So let's start with the word trauma. How would you define it?
Yes, and to me that's very important because trauma can mean a single event, it can mean a series of events, or it can mean a set of conditions that are dangerous and unsafe. Most of our clients have suffered from enduring conditions of danger. There may have been events, but in child abuse, for example, that's a whole environment. That's a set of conditions. Because even on the days that no events take place, the child is still frightened, still ashamed, still hopeless, still trapped. And another component of that makes it traumatic is that it has to be overwhelming and it has to create the fear of threat to life and sanity.
One of the core ideas in your work is that symptoms can be understood as survival adaptations. What do you mean by that?
Well, actually, what I say is that the symptoms tell the story. And often they tell the story better than whatever we remember. So we see this even in people who say, oh, my family was fine, everything was perfect. But we see the symptoms, and the symptoms tell us, oh, it probably wasn't so perfect. So the symptoms tell the story, sometimes of what happened, but also how we survived it.
I can recognize this from my work when I meet patients, that they often carry it in the symptoms. It shows up in the symptoms rather than them telling about what happened.
Yes, exactly.
And many trauma survivors get labeled as too much or even untreatable. How can we understand that?
Well, and the other thing they get labeled is a borderline personality disorder. That's probably the most frequent. And I think that we have seen trauma survivors as difficult to treat because there is no understanding of trauma built into training for psychology, psychiatry, or psychotherapy.
And you often talk about parts and inner conflict. And when you say parts, what do you mean?
Well, you know, someone just gave me the best way to scientifically understand parts. They're really brain states. So, as we experience life, the brain organizes those experiences. And again, the brain has areas like this part of the brain that remembers in words, but other parts of the brain remember feelings, sensations, sounds, smells. We have many kinds of brain states. When children, especially when children are traumatized, if you think that trauma is a very unique individual experience, something that happens to a 3-year-old will have much more impact than if the same thing happens to a 30-year-old. When we are little, in the face of this overwhelming experience and very limited resources, the brain takes advantage of the fact that it is made up of states. And we see separate brain states arising. So a brain state that's scared, a brain state that just picks up and continues to go on as if nothing had happened, a brain state that is compliant because compliance is safety in a very traumatic world, a state that is trying to elicit help, trying to win sympathy. So all the states we need to defend against the dangers that in an abusive family, a child faces those dangers every day, not just on the days that something happens.
So this sounds like survival adaptations to me. Is that correct to say?
Yes. And the brain has the mechanism of dissociation, which is a mental ability. And it's been pathologized in our field because it is misunderstood as severe multiple personality disorder. So the word dissociation is very unpopular. There's a lot of research that shows that dissociative symptoms in patients are usually labeled borderline, and that dissociative disorders are very underdiagnosed. There's also a school of thought that says we're all fragmented. We all have different states depending on what we're doing. So we're now in the state of doing a podcast. But that would be a different state than seeing a patient. It would be a different state to play with a child, a different state to go shopping and accomplish certain important small tasks. So this is the theory of internal family systems, and Richard Schwartz is we all have parts. And I think that's true. And we talk about that. We say, one part of me wants to do this and one part of me wants to do that.
Like to me, right now, it comes a feeling like of that it's hopeful to see dissociation as a part of oneself, that it's not something pathological, rather than it's one part of a patient that has experienced something and tries to protect herself from pain.
Yeah. Now, dissociation is not conscious. So we can't dissociate consciously. The brain has dissociation as a mechanism for helping us under stress. And in an unsafe environment, such as an abusive family, the child has to rely on the brain dissociating. And because it's dangerous or potentially dangerous every single moment.
This correlates to my next question, because a lot of people carry shame about their reactions, whether that shows up as dissociation, overwhelm, numbness, or harsh self-criticism. How can we begin to understand those responses with more compassion? You touched this, but if you could elaborate it a bit more.
Well, shame is part of the submission response. And, we see it in animals too. If your dog has done something wrong and you raise your voice, the dog looks ashamed. And apparently people who are familiar with horses say that horses have the shame response. So it seems to be a compliance, part of the compliance response. And it increases safety in an unsafe world. Because if you comply, it's going to be a little bit safer than if you fight back. So blaming oneself makes it easier to submit. Thinking you're worthless makes it easier to submit. And so I think the internal self-criticism that we see, often a very critical voice that says you're stupid, you're worthless, that is actually survival promoting. Because if the child thinks I'm stupid, the child will be less likely to share their opinion with abusive parents, right? Children who feel safe share their opinions all the time, right? Whether they're 3-year-old opinions or 12-year-old opinions. So many of these symptoms of disconnection and numbing is absolutely essential. And it's not something we can do purposefully. I can't say I'm numb and I want to be numb and then go numb, right? We either go numb or we don't. And for some trauma survivors, numbing becomes a way to survive.
To me, this sounds like when you say that self-criticism can be like submitting, and it sounds like protection from the parent. And what do they protect themselves from if they self-criticize?
If they self-criticize, if we asked our audience to notice how they react to self-criticism, most people get quieter. They try to be more invisible. They don't state their opinion because they just called it stupid. They say pleasing things. Well, whatever you want is okay. And those are all valuable ways of surviving. Abusive parents, for the most part, most abusers, are not cold and calculating killers, right? They are very disturbed people, usually triggered by the child's vulnerability, and they become angry, sadistic. And so the less trouble the child gives them, the less likely they are to be triggered. So anything that makes the child quieter and more compliant promotes survival.
So it's one way to create distance, to be safe.
Yes, exactly. Or safer, yes.
And you have developed a model, trauma-informed stabilization treatment. Can you tell us what that is and why it helps trauma patients?
I developed it because the other models that we have available to us, we have many trauma-informed models. We have some parts models, but we didn't have a trauma-informed parts model. And I found that so many of my trauma patients were fragmented, meaning they were internally conflicted. They were behaving in ways they didn't want to behave. They were self-destructive, or they were so disconnected and numb that they could function, but they couldn't actually enjoy their lives. I was asked by a hospital for the chronically mentally ill to design a treatment model, a trauma treatment model, for a group of their patients who were chronically suicidal. They were so chronically suicidal, they had been in locked institutions for 2 or more years. And they were young. They were in the age group between 20 and 25. So already at that young age, they had spent 2 or more years of their lives in a locked hospital. Obviously, the treatment needed to be trauma-informed. I am a very big proponent of the structural dissociation model of Otto van der Hart, Ellert Nijenhuis, and Kathy Steele, which I'm sure is familiar to most therapists in Sweden. The structural dissociation model is very little known in the US. So I took that model and I said, okay, this model is a way to explain the suicidal self-destructive behavior of these patients. It's also is a way to explain why sometimes they are violent toward staff members. And so they need a treatment model that is trauma-informed, that understands structurally dissociated parts, and gives the client a mindfulness-based way of working with their symptoms and parts. And so that became TIS, that became trauma-informed stabilization treatment. The patients liked the model and they understood it. So from the very, very beginning, by labeling their suicidal behavior and their violent behavior as the behavior of a fight part, they were able to have more control over their suicidal impulses, because they learned to say, oh, that's the suicidal part. That's not me. That's the suicidal part. And I don't have to do what it says. So within a very short time, meaning months, the patients with whom we use this treatment were better. Some were a little better. Some were dramatically better. And really within a few months, 2 of them were able to leave the hospital and live semi-independently. So, which was really the goal, that these 21 and 22-year-olds should not spend the rest of their lives in an institution. So then I thought, well, if it's so effective on people who are so symptomatic, they had a very hard time participating in traditional psychotherapy, whether it's CBT or psychodynamic therapies. But they did well with TIST. So I thought, all right, if they do so well with it, other people will do well with it. And I started to treat my own patients with it. And now we have training programs in the US, in France, Italy, Germany, and South America. So it's very, very exciting, and exciting to see how therapists and patients really like the model. And I've learned that it's important that the patient like the model because we can have a wonderful model like EMDR, but if the patients don't like it, then we can't use it. So TIST is designed to make it easy for the patient to like it.
And why do you think they liked it?
Well, I think they like it because it takes away the pathology. So even at the hospital where we launched this new method, the patients who were given this new treatment, they said, "Oh, so I'm not a mental patient. I'm a trauma patient. Oh, that's much better." Right? Because I'm not crazy. It means real things happened that have disturbed me. So I think that the trauma-informed piece is very important. And TIST focuses on understanding the trauma responses as the parts, right? Parts who are still scared, parts who still believe it's safer to be dead than to be alive, parts that are still ashamed, parts that still feel abandoned and lonely. And so it's a mindfulness-based approach. So I teach clients to notice distressing feelings as parts. And to notice, this is how I represent it, the fearful part, the scared part. And then to notice themselves noticing the scared part. So it's taking advantage of basic mindfulness practices, because in mindfulness meditation, we notice a thought as a thought, a feeling as a feeling, a body sensation as a sensation. And there is this same sort of mental separation, not disconnection. I don't want, right? Because some patients get upset because they say, I've been trying so hard not to disconnect. I don't want to learn a model that's about disconnecting. But I say, no, this is about connection, right? Notice the part with this intense feeling of fear, and notice you noticing how scared that part is. And what it does is it creates a relationship between the patient and the feeling, and the patient and the part, which helps with another symptom of trauma, which is the fear of emotion. So many trauma survivors are afraid of emotion because they have such limited capacity for tolerating emotion. But this helps them to tolerate the emotion.
This sounds really amazing, because it sounds like this model gives the patient an ability to structure the feelings and to understand it as being part of oneself and being here and now and tolerating it, not being afraid of it.
Right, exactly. Right. And and sometimes patients will say, I can't separate from it. And then I say, well, just, you know, move your hands farther away. So you're looking at the part from a little more distance and you're seeing how ashamed that part is. And then you're noticing you noticing. And it's a learning. But as they learn to be in relationship to the part, they can feel their whole bodies calming and settling. The part may still have the emotion, but it's not as intense because there's a sense that the part is not alone. And that's one of the things that I think patients like and I like about the model is that the simple thing of just noticing a part is in distress is reparative, right? Nobody notices that abused children are in distress. Nobody takes an interest in how they're feeling. No one stays with them. And when the patient and I do this, the next step is to stay with that part. And that makes a huge difference. Imagine there's a little child part that's deeply afraid, and somebody stays with that part. That is reparative. I mean, it doesn't magically repair everything bad, but it's a little step toward repair.
It sounds very compassionate.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's one of the goals. But it's a goal that we don't teach the client. It's not cognitive because most trauma survivors have a very negative reaction to the word compassion and a much even worse reaction to the word self-compassion. They say, don't talk about that. I'm not doing that. I think because self-compassion is dangerous in a dangerous world. If we're compassionate, we are more open, more relaxed. We feel very warm and inclusive. And that's not a state that is safe in an abusive situation.
That's really an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. I always look for how does the symptom make sense? How is it trying to help?
In your model, behaviors like self-harm, suicidality, or addiction are understood as protective. And you explained how you see self-criticism, for example. And how do you understand self-harm, suicidal thoughts, addiction? Like, what are they trying to protect the patient from?
Right. Well, in the structural dissociation model, the parts are driven by the survival defenses. So there's a part or parts that fight, a part or parts that flee, a part or parts that are afraid, a part or parts that submit, and a part or parts who cry for help. So the suicidal thoughts, passive suicidal thoughts like I wish I was dead, those are thoughts that the submit part has. Because they go with being hopeless, feeling ashamed, feeling at fault, feeling worthless. The actual violent action of trying to kill yourself is something that only the fight part can accomplish. Because fight is the only survival response associated with aggression. So you can run, but that's not very aggressive. Addiction, I see as a type of flight response. Right? It's a way of escaping from feelings. And I put eating disorders in the same category. So in TIST, when there are issues of self-harm, suicidality, eating disorders, or addiction, we say, okay, let's be curious about the alcoholic part. Let's be curious about the anorexic part. And, it's extraordinary. I'm thinking of an anorexic patient I had many years ago. As soon as we started to speak of the anorexia as an anorexic part, the kind of intensity of the anorexia began to soften. And the most important thing is that when the patient said, oh, the anorexic part doesn't want me to eat, that was a very different statement than I can't eat. So immediately there was improvement as soon as she understood the anorexia as being a part, trying to convince her to starve herself. And we teach patients to ask suicidal parts, what are you worried about if I live? Right? Or ask the alcoholic part, what are you worried about if I don't drink? Or ask the anorexic part, what are you worried about if I eat? And usually those parts say, I'm afraid you're going to fall apart because you cannot handle the feelings of the vulnerable parts.
What does stabilization actually look like in practice, both in therapy and in everyday life?
It looks like I'm thinking of one particular patient of mine who had been chronically suicidal for years. And she had several different therapists because each would get overwhelmed by the intensity of her suicidality. And so they would send her to someone else who theoretically was better at dealing with suicidal clients. But she was tortured. Her children and her husband were tortured by this risk to her life because she talked constantly about planning her suicide and when she was going to do it. Once we identified it as a part, it took just a few months before she could also call it the suicidal part. And the suicidal part got quite angry because it was used to being taken seriously. But gradually, when we kept emphasizing that the suicidal part had been trying to help, that the suicidal part thought that the patient couldn't handle her feelings or her part's feelings and was trying to help her out. So giving the suicidal part validation and her understanding it as a part reduced the suicide threats from several times a week down to 3 or 4 times a year.
And this sounds like when the patient can, in one way, understand these symptoms, these thoughts, and externalizing it, in one way, putting it outside of oneself and being able to meet oneself, not being completely overwhelmed by it, but actually being able to structure it out and looking at it,
Right.
having more insight and looking at it with curiousness. That
Yes.
helps.
Exactly, it helps, and also in the case of the suicidal patient, it really helped her to realize that the suicidal part's intention was to kill her and all the other parts. And she kept insisting, oh, every part of me wants to die. It's okay. Everybody's in agreement with the suicidal part. And I remember I said to her, I am sure that every part of you wants relief, but I doubt that they want to be killed. And that really got her to think, oh, the suicidal part is offering to kill me. I don't know if I want to be killed. That reminds me of a conversation you had with a client that you posted on LinkedIn, where I think the client had said something about not being able to love anybody else if he didn't love himself. Can you tell that story? Yes, it's a common belief trauma survivors have, that they can't possibly love themselves. They actually feel disgust at the idea. And I remember I said to him, I'm not asking you to love yourself. I'm just asking you to care about these young parts. You don't have to have compassion for you, but you can have compassion for these children who lived through so much. And that works. Trauma survivors tend to have a lot of compassion for children and animals and anyone less fortunate. And so this idea that the parts are just children, and most clients know they have been through a lot. It's interesting, even if the patient has been in some denial about the extent of the abuse they suffered, they understand that the parts have suffered. And that it's very interesting. They might say, well, I didn't think it was so bad, but when the parts are afraid of being in the same danger they were earlier in life, most patients understand. So when it connects to a younger part of oneself, it's easier to find the compassion. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And we're nearing the end of the episode, and I would like to thank you for your time, your participation, and for bringing your knowledge. And some last words. If there is one message you hope both listeners and clinicians take from this conversation about suffering, survival, and healing, what would it be? That healing comes about not through remembering the past, not through remembering or processing the terrible events. The healing comes from the connection between the person we are today and our young hurt parts. And so that's what I look for. I don't believe we have to remember the past to cure it. I think what we need are new experiences that heal the old experiences. And, besides LinkedIn, the other place where your listeners can even download articles and ebooks and other resources is my website. which is janinafisher.com. So I try to keep many resources available, including a directory of therapists trained in TIST.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher.
You're so welcome. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.